Hello, everyone. Welcome to Azure Psych. And today I want to talk about the idea of whether or not IQ can change. I spent a lot of time in my undergraduate research studies kind of studying and writing papers on the idea of intelligence because I was interested in the concept of social maladjustment in people with gifted IQs, or essentially struggles that people with high IQs face in adapting to normal social environments. But today I want to talk about whether or not your IQ can kind of change. Because one thing that I see asked a lot when I am on like psychology forums and stuff is people ask the question, well, is your IQ something that you can develop? Is it something that you can change? Can you become smarter and raise your IQ? And the answer is yes and no. And it's more no than yes, but there is some yes to it. And that's what I want to talk about. Let's get into it. The problem people face when they ask this specific question is that they think it's a very black and white answer. And the truth is that it's very much not so black and white. There's a lot of kind of middle ground here, and there's a lot of circumstances that can involve you or your IQ changing. One thing specifically we need to keep in mind when we're talking about IQ is that your brain isn't fully developed until around the ages of, like 23 to 25. So your IQ can drastically change in between, 5 years old and 23-year-olds because of things like malnourishment, stress, trauma. Any kind of life event can have a huge impact on your level of intelligence, especially things that are physiological, like, lack of nutrition. Now, if you were to lack these specific things, you might find that you would be lowered from your maximum kind of cognitive potential. Your maximum level of IQ would go down because your body had to focus on surviving, getting through things, and making sure that it had the basics it needs just to get by. And therefore, your brain might not have fully developed. But this is not what people, I think, are asking when they ask, can your IQ change? People are more so interested in the idea of, if I study a lot and practice mind games, can my IQ change? Can I become a smarter person? Will I be able to develop my score to be something higher? Another incorrect assumption that people make about IQ is that they think it's this single static number that represents kind of you and your level of intelligence, and that your IQ can't change. And of course, this isn't true. If you asked someone to take an IQ test 5 times, they're going to have a different score each and every time, most likely. But it's going to be around kind of this same central score. It's going to have a central tendency to it. And this is exactly what we look at when we look at the overall population of IQ. So now let's look at the standard distribution of IQ. The average IQ across the whole world is 100. If you have an IQ of 100, you're a completely average, normal, healthy human. So that means that within one standard deviation down or up of 100, which is a standard deviation of 15 in most systems, this is going to be considered an average range IQ. So an IQ from 85 to 115 is considered an average range IQ. And optimally, this is going to be the IQ that most people are going to want, because if you're in this IQ range, especially on the higher end of this average, you're going to have a pretty easy time getting through life. You're probably going to be fairly successful. You'll be able to get along with most people. Now, the thing that people don't realize is that when you take an IQ test, again, it's your current cognitive potential, and this current cognitive potential doesn't represent your true intelligence. It represents you at the time of taking the test. So, say for example, you took an IQ test and then you spent a month studying the types of questions that would be on an IQ test, and then you took an IQ test a month later. Your score would very much likely go up, and studies reflect this. The test-retest variable with IQ tests can be 10 to 15 points, which is a huge difference in IQ. I mean, it's drastic. So what does this mean for IQ? It means that IQ is just a representation of where you currently are mentally. It is not a pure reflection of your intelligence. Now, I do want to clarify and make sure that you understand that this doesn't mean that you can train your IQ. The reason I call it your current cognitive potential is because you, specifically as an individual, likely have an IQ ceiling as well. As likely you probably have a floor. So just as we have an IQ kind of standard distribution of scores, 100 is the average, and then you have the standard deviations, you also have one of those standard distributions that's unknown to you of your own scores. So if you took an IQ test 100 different times and you averaged out those scores and took the standard deviations, then you'd have a better representation of what your score is likely to be like, because you'd understand what your average is and what you're likely to score on a very good day and what you're likely to score on a very bad day. What would it look like if you spent a month studying? What would it look like if you spent a month doing nothing related to practicing or experimenting with your mind and doing kind of mental puzzles? And the thing that a lot of people fail to realize is that people who end up in high IQ fields, for example, often spend more time doing mental practice type things, and therefore their minds are more primed for the types of things that are already on IQ tests. So therefore they're already practiced for the IQ test, where you find that people who are in the average ranges aren't messing with things in this range kind of daily because they might not be interested in things like abstract puzzle solving, mathematics, quantitative thoughts, these types of things. If you took an average person and asked them to spend, a month studying and then got them to take the test, you would see that their score would increase within a specific score range. Again, it could be 10 to 15 points, which is a full standard deviation. That's huge. Now, is this person likely to score 30 points higher than where they were? Like if you have an IQ of 100 and you spend a month studying, are you going to go from 100 to 130? No. And that's the difference. You have a cognitive potential. What is your cognitive potential? What is the range in which your IQ could reach if you spent most of your time, practicing and working on your mind and thinking about things and working with your working memory? And that's going to be the truest reflection of your IQ, is this kind of current cognitive potential, the range of IQ scores that you could represent. If you talk to people who take tons and tons of IQ scores, especially the ones who are involved in like high IQ societies and things of that nature, you'll see that they tend to score in the upward range, but at the same time, they can score well below that on a bad day. They can just have a day where they're stressed. They can have a day where they're not doing so well and their score is 20 points lower. It's easier to score lower on a bad day than it is to score higher on a good day when it comes to IQ. But at the same time, if you put in the mental effort, you can raise your cognitive potential to be at a higher point than it would be if you just sat around all day doing nothing related to your mind or practicing things. So the answer to the question of can your IQ change is no, your IQ can't really change, but the odds are that every individual in the world is not living up to their current cognitive potential. They're not living up to the IQ that they could have if they were going to be focusing on things related to cognitive tasks, working memory, processing speed all day long. That leads to the question, though, should you be focusing on these things all the time? Should you be concerned with living up to your cognitive potential at every given moment? No, I think you should be focused on doing what makes you happy. IQ is only a single metric, and as long as you're not below like that 80 to 90 range, you're going to be fine in almost any field you want to choose. If you're above 115, you can do pretty much anything unless you want to be like an astrophysicist, and even then you could probably do it. You would just have a little bit harder time than the people who are, in the 130s and above. Most fields created by humans are completely accessible to people within the average range of IQ scores, and I don't think it's good for people to be obsessing over the idea of IQ. Now, I think IQ has a lot of really interesting implications when it comes to things like social development and all of the things related to that, but I don't think it's something that people should focus on, and I think it just tends to make people neurotic. They become obsessed with the specific score that they have or the score that someone else has, and that's not healthy, and it becomes the ego thing. I'm willing to bet that people are going to watch this video, and at least some of them are going to be like, oh, IQ is stupid, IQ this and that. People just want to flaunt their IQ, and that completely misses the point of the useful and interesting implications that IQ has. I think it really is a useful metric, but it's something that people spend too much time focusing on in the incorrect ways. So I encourage you out there, if you're interested in knowing your IQ, maybe, take a few online tests or go see a psychologist to find out, but don't become hyper-focused with trying to raise your IQ if you didn't meet the score that you originally wanted to meet. If you're above 100, you're completely fine. You're going to be able to do almost anything you want to do, and the things that would be difficult for you are probably not things you want to do anyway. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on IQ and whether or not it can change, and just my general opinions about this topic. This is something that I see come up again and again on psychology forums, different Reddit forums, these sorts of things. And to me, it's one of those things that just doesn't have that clear-cut black and white answer that people want. And that's why I think it's important to talk about the nuances of these types of things. If you agree with me, let me know down in the comment section below. If you disagree, that's fine too. I always tell people that I think if you disagree with me, you should tell me, because for me, a lot of these videos that I make is just to kind of start a discussion. I'm not trying to tell you that I'm right or wrong. I'm trying to give you my opinion so then we can start a discussion about them. So feel free to start a discussion down in the comment section below on this topic, and maybe I'll hop in and, answer a few comments, things of that nature. Other than that, I would like to remind people that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website at starpsych.com if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura from Starpsych. Have a good one.